It's the top of the hour, so let's go ahead and get started. Hi, everybody. Welcome to the Bumblebee short course for community scientists. I'm Denise Ellsworth with OSU Extension and OSU Department of Entomology. Nice to see everybody here. So at this point, I'm excited to have Jamie Strange back with us. You got my long intro last week. I'm going to give a shorter one this week. He's still amazing, a researcher, academic presenter, outreach educator, teaches academic classes. In fact, he's off to teach his Pollinator course this afternoon. Really known nationally and internationally for his work with bumblebees, and a professor and chair here in the Department of Entomology. So Jamie, thanks so much. I know you have lots of plates in the air, but I really appreciate your time here with us on the Bumblebee short course. Can't wait to learn more about those bumbles.
I need to unmute myself first.
Oh, there you go. I could see you hunting. I figured you're hunting.
No, it's looking, too many screens. I lost my cursor, and so I'm going to see if I can do this.
And while you're doing that, I forgot, folks, I will turn the chat box off now, so you can't chat anymore until Jamie's done, and then we'll turn the chat box back on. But you will not have that scroll on your screen here as soon as I find that box on my end.
All right, you should be looking at my slide here.
Yep, looks great.
Oh, right, good. So everybody, there were a ton of questions last week. Denise sent some to me. I tried to answer a few. I apologize. I was really kind of, I'm speechless. There were so many really well thought out questions, and people asked a lot of stuff. So I tried to get to a few. The one that I thought I would start off with, a lot of people asked about deer repellents and impacts on bees that deer repellents might have. So I actually will admit that before that question came up, I knew next to nothing about deer repellents, but little digging, and I found out that most deer repellents actually are based on what's called putrefied egg whites and garlic. And so it's essentially an odor deterrent for deer, or maybe a taste deterrent too. I'm guessing that's what putrefied egg whites. They do not sound delicious to me. And then they add in some other stuff like mint oil and things like that to make it palatable. Not palatable, not completely disgusting to us, I'm guessing. But so I guess that mixture of stuff is supposed to make deer think that it tastes really gross and it smells really gross. I would say that I didn't see anything in there that's directly toxic to bees. So bees can probably be fine with that being sprayed around plants. I would avoid spraying it directly on blooming plants that you might want to have bees visiting. So because they might find it to be scent-wise difficult to locate the flower if you actually spray the flower with putrefied egg whites. So I thought I'd throw that one out there as one thing. I think you're probably fine using your deer repellent if you, again, don't spray it directly on the flowers. And then the other one that I just saw in the chat here earlier was whether or not a question about carpenter bees. And carpenter bees are not bumblebees. They are not social. They're solitary. And so those aren't queens. They're reproductive females that you're probably seeing in males, but they're not heading a colony per se. So I just thought I'd throw those two out before I jump into bumblebee biology. And the one thing I really going to focus on today is sort of talking about the queen's solitary phase of her life cycle. So how she spends her winter, and then things you might be seeing now as you're out in the garden looking, and what to look for as far as bumblebees this time of year. There we go. Okay. So here's the phase we're going to start with, this wintering phase. We've got the queens and males, new queens and new males. So the old queen is going to die at the end of summer. We're back to that point. All the workers are going to die off. And then queens and males are mating late summer, early fall. The males then die. They do not overwinter. And the mated queen, queens have this organ called a spermatheca, and the spermatheca is a sperm storage organ. So after they mate, the sperm are stored in there, and the queen overwinters with that sperm in her. So she's going to find that spot. She's going to dig into the soil, and spend the winter under the ground or under some leaf litter or something like that. However, after the queen mates, they first feed, and they feed a lot on nectar, and they feed on pollen. And this feeding helps them prepare to hibernate by building up this organ inside bees called the fat body. And the fat body is kind of like it's like the super organ in insects. So it's energy storage, it's metabolism. It has functions in hormone and hormone production within inside the insect. So it's a really important organ. But this will grow, and it becomes a large, fully formed fat body before the queen's going to hibernate. And so that requires a lot of nectar and pollen to build up that. And then at the same time, the sugar content and glycogen content in the hemolymph. And hemolymph is the insect blood. It's not red like human blood. It's clear generally, but that hemolymph will build up sugars and glycogen, which are for energy, but also some of the sugars and the glycogen also have some antifreeze properties. And so, in fact, in bumblebees, if temperatures drop too low, that glycogen can be then converted into glycerin, essentially, as an glycol as an antifreeze agent inside the bee to keep them from getting a lot of freeze damage. There's a lot of other sort of antifreeze things that happen. There's antifreeze proteins that happen in insects and have been documented in a number of insects. And so there are things that the insects can do to help prevent cellular damage from freezing. Bumblebees are generally pretty good at this, but again, part of their behavior is to dig into the soil, which is freeze avoidance, not freeze tolerance, which would be having these sugars and glycogen in the hemolymph, the antifreeze proteins and things like that. So they're going to try to stay away from the freezing, but if they do get some freezing, their bodies are adapted to tolerating some of that. So the queen goes through the winter. This is the mated queen. At this phase, we don't really call her queen, we call her a gyne. And the reason is that we really reserve that term queen for a bee which is heading a nest of daughters. And so since she does not at this point have daughters, we would refer to her as a gyne. But if you use queen, that's fine. Most people do. Most people aren't using the scientific term for these queens which are in their solitary phase. So that they dig into the soil, often several inches, try to get down below the frost line if they can. But again, they can tolerate some of that freeze and thaw. They are capable of that. And, and they remain there for like I said, up to 8 months. The reality is if you get up into the Arctic, it's often 9 months that they're in this solitary wintering hibernation phase. So that's an awful long time. But what I think is most interesting about wintering in bees is that for as much time as they spend in this winter phase, we know remarkably little about how they get through it. And you could probably think for a few minutes of how many bumblebees you found in the middle of winter, and it's very few because they're hard to find. They've hidden themselves away from the cold. They've hidden themselves away from us. And so when we find them, it's generally luck that brings us to that, not a concerted effort to go out and look for them. So they're actually pretty good at staying away from us. And so we do have, colonies that we can rear in the lab. We can subject them to certain chill and freeze treatments and do all sorts of things to do observations. But what actually happens out in nature is a lot harder to know. And there are a couple different initiatives to kind of get to this. There's one that's a community science project called Queen Quest, and you can go on to you can Google Queen Quest and bumblebees, and you will find a web page. And unfortunately, right now it's kind of rudderless, in that we don't have a champion for the project. But we're looking for a new person to kind of run it. But it's a way to go out in the fall and winter and document hibernating queens. And if you do have anecdotal stories where you see a queen digging into the ground and you want to help us, you can go on to QueenQuest and share that observation. And there's a certain amount of data we ask that you input with it. So it's not just like, yeah, I saw one. You have to tell us where and what it was doing. But that information can then be used by scientists to sort of learn more about where to look for these overwintering queens. So I want to talk about spring emergence. This is some data I generated over several years. These are from wild queens that we caught and brought into the lab to try to initiate nesting in the lab. And we did a bunch of searching out in Logan, Utah. We did a bunch out in Oregon. And then I kind of graphed these so you could sort of see these different species. These are the species. Get the cursor over here. These are the species right here. So we have Bombus appositus, which is these small orange bars. We didn't get a lot of those. Bombus bifarius, which is these darker blue bars. And then species which is really common out in Utah called Bombus huntii, or the hunt bumblebee. And how many of those? These are just counts of queens, and then these are weeks of the year. So week 13, 14, 16 would be like the last week of April would be week 16. And so this is basically May, where you see this huge emergence of bumblebee queens. Generally the second week of April is kind of the best time to see them. And that tapers off as the season goes on. But what's really interesting, this lighter bar right here, lighter sort of grayish blue bar, this is Bombus griseocolus, which is a bee that's common throughout the United States, but it is what we consider a later emerging bee. So its population, its queen emergence doesn't really peak until June. And so we see a lot of them. This is, of course, in Utah. You go somewhere else, the timing's going to be different because climate's different. But yeah, in Utah, they didn't peak until June. And then we saw a lot of them even into early July. Those would still be emerging. So this just gives you an idea that different species have different habits in when they will come out and when they will begin nest initiation. So you might see some species that are early emergers and other species which are late emergers. And then in Oregon, to sort of underscore that, you'll notice this is the same time. This is week 13. So this is April. And in April in Oregon, we caught a lot of these Bombus vosnesensky. Now, I wasn't in Oregon at the time, so we didn't continue to go out every week. But this was low elevation around south of Portland, Corvallis area, if you're out there right now. And so these were the bees that were flying. These vosnesensky were very common at that time. Later in the season, we would go to high elevation, and you'll notice the vosnesensky aren't nearly as common. There's a few of them that are flying, but these other species actually were fairly common at that time. And this is that Bombus bifarius, which it actually came out much later in Oregon than it did in Utah, because spring in the mountains in Oregon comes a little bit later than it does in Utah. So we had some more data. This is from Washington and California. What I just wanted to point out on these two is that low elevations in Washington, this is the Puget Sound area, very early in the year. So these bees are coming out in February, and this is a species called Melanopygus, which is considered one of the earliest emerging bees we have in North America. And same thing in California. It comes out very early, this orange bars here. And vosnesensky a little bit, but mostly they come out a bit later. So again, some things can come out really, really early in the season. This is all just to point out to you that there's a lot of variation with geography, with elevation, and with species. So they all have their different timings, and they're all fitting into their particular niche in the ecosystem, whether that's where they occur or when they emerge. And so just wanted to share that with you. This sort of inspired me to put like all the states and all the bees together. These are the four most abundant ones we collected over the years. And you'll see that, yep, Melanopygus is way up here early in the year with some vosnesensky. Those vosnesensky really peak it's by the beginning of April, really across sites, except for the highest elevations in Oregon. And then huntii is a little bit later, and then bifarius is a little later still. So that's just to give you an idea. that across space and time, there's a lot of emergence. And so if you're like, what's going to happen in my town? I probably can't tell you that right now. But this is the time of year, no matter where you are, when you should be seeing, well, unless you're at very high elevations, probably you folks up in, I shouldn't say that because you folks up in Alaska probably aren't seeing bumblebees flying yet, but you might be seeing them very soon. And also that things tend to peak and you get a whole bunch of queens at any given time once they do peak. All right, so what do they do once they come out of the ground? What's this emergence thing we're talking about? So they dig their way out and they fly. Frequently, they'll fly for several days where they're primarily feeding, and they'll feed on pollen and nectar, but mostly nectar. They're mostly rebuilding that fat body store they have. So they're going to take in a lot of carbohydrates and fly around, and that's what's in the nectars, sugars. So they're going to do that. They'll spend a lot of time foraging. They'll spend some time searching, what we call nest searching. And so they're generally, this is a behavior. It's you can identify this pretty quickly, because what it'll be is the queen will be flying low to the ground, usually within a foot or two of the soil surface. And then occasionally she'll drop down and you'll see her crawl along the ground. And usually what she's doing, she's looking for holes in the ground because she wants to go in there. Or maybe like in this illustration, she'll see a dark area like a log, and she'll decide that's the space that she wants to go investigate. So she'll drop down to the ground and she'll crawl in there. Sometimes they'll be in there for several minutes. Sometimes they go in and very quickly turn around and come out and start flying again. And so this is their nest searching behavior. Flying low to the ground, often back and forth. They look like they're searching for something, and they are. So you can see this behavior. If you see it, this is a good time not to disturb the bee, but it's also kind of fun to follow them and observe and see where they land. And know that they frequently will investigate many holes in the ground. It's rare that they find one and just go in there. But usually within the first week of the time that they've emerged from their hibernation, they will find something which is suitable and take that over. There are a lot of different bumblebees, and they all have different nesting habitats. So I can't give you a universal, this is what it's going to look like, because in fact, some bumblebees will even nest in tree cavities, in birdhouses. I think Sam Droege, who's on the call, was or on the webinar today, was brought up at one point that they're frequently known to eject chickadees from their birdhouses. So you think eject chickadees, and I tell my anecdotal story of a couple years ago. I had a bumblebee queen nest searching in my yard, Bombus impatiens, and she dropped to the ground, and I watched her crawl into a hole and crawl out of the hole, and then she flew away. She came back the next day, crawled in the hole, and then the following day I was out looking to see if she was there, and instead of finding her, I found a dead mouse directly outside of the hole. So I don't know if she chased it out or if she stung it or what she did, but the bee was there and the mouse no longer was. So yeah, bumblebees can be a little aggressive, I think, when they want something that they want. Now, I have no idea what happened between the time I saw her searching that hole and the time the mouse ended up dead, but it did seem like quite a coincidence to me. So you may see them in a hole in the ground. You might see them going into a birdhouse, depending on the species. You might see them go into underneath a shed or a crack in the foundation. They find all sorts of places to nest, and so keep your eyes out for that. But look for that nest searching behavior this time of year. Look for queens on flowers that are nectaring and building up those rebuilding their fat body reserves after they came out of hibernation. So one other thing that you see bumblebees flying really early in the season, and this time of year, you might think, well, boy, it's awfully cold. How's that bumblebee out there foraging? And the way it's doing it is that they have what's called countercurrent heat exchange, and so they can build up a lot of heat by shivering. Essentially, they vibrate their thoracic. This is their thorax is here. And this is actually, this shows the thorax without any muscles in there, but the thorax is just packed with muscles. If you dissect the bumblebee, you'll notice very quickly, and it's identifiable as muscle, that this area is packed with muscle, and it's really to power flight and walking, and other things they do with their legs. So they are quite muscular there, and that generates a lot of heat when those muscles are firing. And so what the heart of the bee, if you'll notice here, I don't know why this is called a heart. They actually have what's called the dorsal vessel that runs through here, and so that there's this is the end where the hemolymph returns through here. It passes through these muscles, and there's these little ripples in this dorsal vessel, which loop through some of that flight muscle, and that allows that hemolymph that's passing back into the abdomen here, because the blood moves from here back through here, allows that to really sort of heat up, and it takes some of the heat out of the thorax and moves it through the rest of the body. And by pumping that through, and you'll see the bees pumping their abdomen, they can move a lot of hemolymph through, and they can heat up that thoracic flight muscles, and heat up the rest of their body so that they can actually fly. And so through this movement of hemolymph and heating of muscles, they're able to generate a lot of sort of extra heat for their flight and to get going. So they can actually heat themselves up from relatively cold temperatures, and there's records of bumblebees flying in temperatures well below 50 degrees Fahrenheit or 10 degrees C. So in fact, I was just reading the other day, somebody was saying they'd seen one at about 3 degrees C, which seemed awfully cold, but they are able to get up and go even when it's cold by producing their own heat. All right, so I'm going to transition real quick. You're going to hear other speakers talk about bee declines and what's causing those things, and I wanted to give you a little bit of background about some of the things that actually are causing those. There's obviously multiple interacting stressors. There's pesticides, there's climate change, there's habitat loss, urbanization, intensification of farming, you name it. But one of the things I'm really interested in is parasites and diseases, and how those drive bumblebee populations, because they're actually quite important in regulating bumblebee populations. So I'm going to run through a series of slides, relatively quickly, and but just to give you sort of an idea of the general biology of some of the things that impact bumblebees as pests and parasites and pathogens. So the first one I want to talk about is actually a parasitic group of bumblebees. There's about 1/10 of the bumblebee species out there are parasites that actually go into other bumblebees' nests. And what happens here late spring, early summer, after some of the bumblebees have begun to establish their colonies, they have a few workers present. Here's the original queen of the colony. She's in there. She's raising brood. She's laid a lot of eggs. Those are developing. And then the parasitic bumblebee will, when she finds that nest, will come into it, and she will kill the, if you will, the rightful queen, and take over that nest. And so through a little bit of bullying of these workers, she'll bite them, she'll push them around. She gets them to work for her and to raise her offspring. So she lays a bunch of eggs, and those offspring will develop into either new females, not workers, but reproductive females, or males, which will then fly out and mate. So they sort of take over this phase of flying out and mating. But the workers of the original queen are the ones that are doing the brood rearing for her. So she's co-opting them to raise her offspring. And a lot of people don't like this and think it's wrong. But it is actually, to me, one of the more fascinating parts of studying bumblebees is that there's an entire group of them which have evolved this inability to raise their own offspring. They're reliant completely on other workers of other species to do it. And I can tell you that even within the normal bumblebees, if you will, there are a lot of them that will happily usurp another bumblebee's nest if they can find it. And so this is not an uncommon behavior in bumblebees to go in, displace a queen which has started a nest and take it over. And in this case of this group of Cytherus, the parasitic or cuckoo bumblebees, it's the only thing they can do because they've actually lost the ability even to gather pollen. They don't have pollen baskets on their hind legs. But they are in fact legitimate bumblebees doing legitimate bumblebee things. All right, so there's a lot of pathogens. I'm going to switch over to the pathogens that we look at. And so there's quite a few that are of interest. And there was this, once bumblebees started to become commercialized, people were beginning to raise them. They were getting to notice more and more what was making them sick, and that some of them died and others didn't. And then as they were being reared in captivity and placed out on the landscape, people began paying attention to something we call pathogen spillover. So pathogen spillover is essentially when you have captive or livestock populations of an organism, and it's got diseases. Those diseases can spread out into closely related species of wild populations. So think about salmon. So once people began farming salmon, we began to see higher concentrations of parasites and disease that were in these salmon farms that were then spilling out into wild populations of salmon. And so this happens there. It can happen with chickens and other birds, and it can happen with all sorts of things. So but it also happens with bees. And so this was kind of first documented by Sheila Kola, Michael Otterstatter in Canada, in these couple papers that came out in the mid to late 2000s. And then later a paper from Nils Cordes associated with a bunch of, that first paper really showed that around commercial greenhouses, some levels of some pathogens were much higher in wild populations than they were farther away. And this suggested that there was some, at least, concentration of pathogens around these commercial areas, and that it could be moving into wild populations. Nils Cordes then published this paper and showed that there was a number of declining bumblebee species that had higher levels of this one pathogen called Nosema bombi. The name has now changed because in science, if we find evidence that we've named something the wrong thing, we have to change it. And so it's now known as Veromorpha. This Nosema, this genus that was called Nosema, is now Veromorpha, so it's now Veromorpha bombi. But these levels of the pathogen much higher in declining species. And then this study in the UK by First showed that where there were honeybees present, bumblebees actually had higher prevalence of deformed wing virus and this other Veromorpha species called Veromorpha serrani. And so those were higher where honeybees were present. So pathogen spillover seems to be happening, at least to some level, from commercial bees. So we did this study, Amber Tripodi, who was a postdoc of mine a few years ago. We did a study where we really were interested in what's in bees across the U.S. And so we did a bunch of surveys in 15 states, and we would catch bees and we would euthanize them and dissect them, and because that's the only way to really get to what's inside their guts. And then we would extract RNA and DNA, and we do PCR. And all of you now, I don't have to explain PCR anymore because of the pandemic. But essentially what you do is you take a little bit of DNA, you run it through a reaction, and it gives you a lot of that DNA. So then you can visualize it on a gel like this, or using a sequencer. And this is how they detect, PCR, whether you have COVID. We would do that, except we were doing it with bee viruses and with these gut parasites that were in bees. So we would do it with RNA or DNA, depending on the organism we were looking at. And we would also do a bunch of microscopy. So we cut the bees open. In this case, this is the larvae of a canopid fly. Canopids are these fly parasites that attack bees and lay their egg on the bee, and their larvae actually develops inside of the bee. And that's what this is here. And then we do some more microscopy to look for little things. This is a picture of Nosema bombi. And then everything else gets stored in a freezer so we can come back to it later and figure out what it is. But then we can see whether it had these trypanosomatids, which is one kind of parasite, one group of parasites, or the neogregorines, which are another group of parasites, the microsporidia, which are those Nosema or Veromorpha species. And then, of course, other bands to show that we actually had bee DNA in there. So we were getting a positive control. We knew that our reactions worked. So there's all these flies that you can detect through what we call the macro parasites. You can detect them with microscopy. This is the canopid fly, a gorgeous little critter, really beautiful. These are phorid flies, maybe not quite as gorgeous, but also really interesting looking. Both of these are parasites of bees. There's a number of species of canopid flies, and there's multiple species of phorid flies that impact bees. Bumblebees have, I think in the US, we found maybe 5 species of canopid flies in our various bumblebees. And it depends where you are. If you're in the East, you get some species. If you're in the West, you get other species, and some are really uncommon and some are really common. That's how insects go. So we had these flies, we had these mites. These are tracheal mites that were inside. This is a close-up of that tracheal mite that actually live in the trachea and in the abdominal air sacs of the bumblebees. That's where these guys are. They're not the same as the tracheal mites that honeybees get. I know somebody's going to ask that question. They're not the same species. These ones are specific to bumblebees. And then there are these nematodes. So there's this queen castrating nematode that gets inside of queen bumblebees and will keep them from reproducing, which is a really interesting parasitic behavior as well. And then there's these horsehair worms, also known as Myrmidhidae, which are really, really uncommon, but we do find in bumblebees occasionally. And so we were finding all these things. We were also finding in some of the bees, we were finding these trypanosomatids as a group of parasites called Crithidia. And that's what these little guys look like. There's a further out picture of them. And they cause various things, but most of them reduce lifespan in the bees. They can cause reductions in reproductive output by colonies, shorter colony lifespan. They can also impact queen overwintering. All of these have negative impacts on the bees at some level, as most parasites do. These are the neogregorines, also the group called Apocystis is the genus that's in bumblebees. And then here's this Veromorpha, the Microsporidia, which used to be called Nosema, and there's Nosema that affects honeybees and Nosema that affects bumblebees, and probably Nosemas that affect all sorts of other things that are out there. And we see these, we have to look at about 400x under the microscope. So you need a pretty good microscope to see most of these things very well. We also look for a number of viruses, and one thing I'll point out is that all of these viruses were originally described in honeybees, and some of them have known pathologies. BQCV is black queen cell virus. DWV is deformed wing virus. There's Israeli acute paralysis virus, Kashmir bee virus, and sac brood virus. These all have some known pathology in honeybees. They don't all have known pathologies in bumblebees, interestingly. Even in the lab with infected colonies that were infected with deformed wing virus, not all the bumblebees, and actually very few, would show any pathology at all. So we don't know if bumblebees are just carriers for these or if they actually are impacted by them in a lot of cases. And it might be that some bumblebees are impacted and others aren't, or that you have to have the right other conditions like poor nutrition or some kind of environmental stress for the virus to actually take off. But lots of viruses for bees overall, and we found all of these inside of bumblebees to some level. But again, without known pathologies, all this stuff is pretty new, right? People have only been working on this for. Oh no, did I freeze? Looks like I'm back. Okay, people have only been working on this for a few years, so. There's not a lot we know about these pathologies, maybe 10 years worth of study on these. So yeah, there's a lot to know. And so you can ask me a lot of virus questions and I probably can't answer most of them. So one of the big take home messages we had from this study was that most of the things we looked at had some kind of pathogen or parasite in it. Queens, for example, over 40, almost 50% of queens had some parasite or pathogen in those queens. Workers, even higher, almost 80% of this is the first 1,000 bees we dissected, but almost 80% of them had some kind of infection or some kind of, it could have been a phoretic mite on the outside. It could have been apocystis. It could have been nosema. It could have been one of the viruses they were carrying. In most cases, they appeared to be perfectly healthy when we caught them. They were out flying around and we got them, but they definitely, there's a lot of diseases, and most bees have something. And even males have a pretty high association, 50% infected as well. What are the things that most have? Well, most bees had this black queen cell virus or sac brood virus. These were two of the most common things we found. And the reality is, we don't really know what either of these viruses do in bumblebees. We just know they've got it. Amber like to say that black queen cell virus was essentially a herpes virus for bees. A huge portion of the population's carrying, whether it's oral herpes or one of the other herpes viruses. There's chicken pox even. A lot of people carry this, and bees as well may be just carrying a lot of virus around the environment and not really impacted by it. And then these were the fungal and protozoan pathogens, the microsporidium, the neogregorines, and trypanosomatids. Those were very common as well. Again, we didn't really look to see, was it a level that was causing real health damage to those bees, or were they just carrying it with them? But it's certainly a lot in the environment that they get exposed to. And then these are the bigger things. So it's a canopid flies, almost 10% parasitism across the country. And then within queens, about 8% were carrying these castrating nematodes. So that's 8% of the queens you see that are never going to make a nest. And then this was just to show that these are bumblebee species going across this x-axis, and on the y-axis is the percent positivity. And this is just to show that some species tend to have really high infection levels and others don't. And so there are specific species interactions with the parasite species as well. And so it's really hard to say, oh, these ones are in danger and those ones aren't, until you actually get in and do the work of saying, are these ones infected? What does that infection mean to them? And with 40 some species in North America, to know what every bee species has going on, well, it requires a lot more than just my lab to do. So there's a lot of work to be done to understand how all of these things impact bumblebees, and to also underscore that I think there's a lot of work to be done on how climate impacts each species, how pesticides do. We're not going to know these things for many years, and even if those of us who are working on it are working very hard, there's just a lot of work that has to be done. And so with that, there are a number of resources that Denise is sharing, so I'm not going to stay on this slide too long, and instead I'll just say that there's over the years we've had a lot of this was my lab out in Logan for a while, and this is some of the folks that are working with me now in Columbus. There's some more people that aren't pictured here because I didn't get a new picture this week, but and then I've had a lot of funding sources that have really helped to do all this, including Tam, who's coming up next and going to talk to you some, but she's also been really great at helping us out. So with that, I'll stop sharing and maybe do a few questions if we have time.
Okay, great. Thanks, Jamie. So you have 5 minutes to answer 83 questions. So what I'd like to do actually is, because there are some really great questions and they really kind of span the spectrum of bumblebee biology. So can you suggest a book or two, a resource, and I have my own in mind in case yours isn't mine, that folks can go to really dig a little deeper into bumblebees?
Sure. So I think the best overall bumblebee book out there is Dave Goulson's Bumblebees, and it's like biology, ecology, and conservation.
I think so.
But yeah, Dave Goulson, and that's a good one. There were a couple questions about general pollination, and I would recommend this book. This is Pollinators and Pollination, and it's by this guy Jeff Ollerton, another Brit. So they're totally beating us on the books at this point. There's also, if you're really interested in this sort of winter survival and how bees do this, And a much better explanation than I can give. Bernd Heinrich wrote Bumblebee Economics, and that's another great resource.
Okay, and folks, I have both the Heinrich and Dave Golson's book on our book list. So if you go again to our website, you'll see that in the dropdown. And I'll add Jeff Ullerson's book. It is really a great read, really interesting. Cites a lot of more recent research, but
yeah, somebody was asking about cockroach pollination. It's in that book. That's where that comes from. Yeah.
Great. So just the one topic, because we really only have like 2 minutes before I want to turn it over to Tam, but there were a number of questions about males. How are you said something last week about seeing the males out flying. So our number one question was, how do you know it's a male? And then what do the males do? How does the queen decide to have a male offspring? And you only have 2 minutes, and I'm starting your timer.
Well, okay. So, how do you know it's a male? Males look a little different. They're generally kind of shaggier. They have longer antennae. They actually have one more abdominal segment, so their abdomen's a little longer. And it's females' abdomen tends to be a little more pointed because they have a stinger. Males don't have stingers, and their abdomens actually tend to be a little more blunt. And so there's a number of things. Some species, the males have these really big googly eyes, but not all of them do that, so it's not the best character. Yeah, I guess really you look at a lot of bees, and then you sort of see the other thing that males don't have. They don't have pollen baskets. So if you see a bee carrying pollen, it's definitely, and it's on its pollen baskets, it's definitely a female. Not that males can't transport pollen, they definitely do. So there's a number of ways visually you can tell them apart when they're on the wing, and the more you get experience identifying them, the quicker you get to that. But I have tried to grab bees that I thought were males and gotten stung. So, I wouldn't advise that as a way to check. Although it would give you a definite answer. Yeah. And then how do they decide to make a male? I wish I knew that one. So there's some suggestion that as the colony becomes more and more crowded at the end of the season, or mid-season, so middle of summer, that the queen will begin, that's a signal to her, this crowding of the colony is a signal to her to begin laying male eggs. How that's actually controlled, I don't know. I know that she is able to restrict the release of sperm from her spermatheca into the eggs. So she can control that. It's sort of muscular control of that release of sperm. When she stops releasing it, all those are going to be male, because male bees develop from unfertilized eggs. So through a process we call parthenogenesis. But how she exactly knows I don't want to release a sperm with this egg, we don't really know.
Okay, great. You did so great on time.
Did I? Because I didn't.
You did.
I wasn't even looking.
So Jamie, thanks again for our Bumblebee Biology Part 2. As I said at the start, we could probably come together for hours and hours, and there's just so much fascinating information to know about bumblebees. But thanks for giving us that overview and kind of digging deep into some of those diseases and parasites. Really, really interesting and illuminating.
All right.
And so now I'd like to switch us over to Tamara Smith, who is a fish and wildlife biologist with the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service, where she's been for about 13 years. Focusing on the Endangered Species Program. I know that here in Ohio, we've interacted with the rusty patch bumblebee, who is our throughout the range, really diminishing in population here. Tam's working with that and other endangered species, and is working on the recovery plan for our rusty patch bumblebee. So Tam, I really appreciate your coming in, giving us kind of an overview of those federally endangered bumblebees. And again, we'll probably only have a few minutes for questions, but really appreciate your time and input.
You bet. Yeah, thank you, Denise. And thanks, Jamie, for your excellent talk as usual. I am going to share my screen here really quick. And I'll start my presentation. Just give me a second here to get situated.
Looks great.
All right. Yeah, just again, thank you, Denise, for the invitation to talk today, and thanks to Jamie. So Denise introduced me. I'm Tam Smith with the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service, and today I'm going to talk with you about some of our federally listed species and some of those that are also under review. And I'm going to spend a little bit more time on rusty patch bumblebee too at the end. It's a species that I definitely am more familiar with and work on every day. And so I'll talk about some of the things that the Fish and Wildlife Service is doing and our partners are doing to help recover that species. So I'm just going to get going right here and just taking a step back to put things into context for folks. What does it mean to be federally endangered, and what does the Endangered Species Act actually do? So the purpose of the Endangered Species Act is to protect and recover imperiled species and their ecosystems in which they depend. Fish and Wildlife Service and the National Marine Fisheries Service administer the ESA. And the primary responsibilities of the Fish and Wildlife Service are for the terrestrial side and the freshwater organisms, while the NIMFS, or National Marine Fisheries Service, focuses primarily on marine wildlife, such as whales and salmon and things like that. And so under the ESA, species might be listed as either endangered or threatened. And so endangered means the species is endangered of extinction throughout all or a significant portion of its range. And threatened means a species is likely to become endangered within the foreseeable future. So there's a little bit of a time component there. All species of plants and animals except for pest insects are eligible for listing under the Endangered Species Act. And the act allows us, it authorizes us to determine whether a species qualifies for endangered or threatened status. And a little bit more background on what the act actually does and the tools that it provides us to recover species. The Endangered Species Act protects listed species and their habitats by prohibiting take of listed animals and plants. It prohibits the interstate and international trade of listed plants and animals, including their parts and products, except if you have a federal permit to do so. And many of those permits are available for conservation scientific purposes. The ESA also provides a framework that requires federal agencies and developers to work with us to minimize impacts, which often results in net conservation benefits to the species. Partnerships are super important with the work we do, such as those with state wildlife agencies, universities, other conservation groups, and just for everyday people. And it's really critical to efforts that we do to conserve listed species. The ESA encourages states, for example, to develop and maintain conservation programs for listed species. And there's some funding available to promote some of that through state participation. There's an array of tools and incentives that can be used to protect interests of private landowners while encouraging management activities that benefit listed and other at-risk species. There's certain sections of the Act that allow for issuance of scientific research permits if the actions are beneficial to the species recovery. So you'll hear about some of the research that's happening, and all those are done under a permit to do so. And but really the law, its ultimate goal is to recover species so that they eventually no longer need that protection under the Act. And we work with our partners to develop and implement recovery plans, and those things describe the steps that are needed to restore a species back to ecological health. And so one more slide about this background kind of stuff before I get into the species themselves. This is just kind of showing our process and our framework for making listing and recovery decisions, in case folks aren't familiar with that. It's kind of a streamlined process that we've developed and refined over the years, but Fish and Wildlife Service first is collects data and on their threats and their status, and conducts a species status assessment, or you might hear people say an SSA. It's a biological document that describes the current state of affairs for the species, and it also projects into the future. And it's used to inform listing decisions. So whether or not to propose the species for listing, and if the species warrants listings, we propose it for listing. It goes through a public comment period, And based on the feedback that we get and also any new information that comes in, we decide whether or not we can finalize that listing. And so then after it's listed, we draft and finalize a recovery plan and then move into the recovery implementation phase, which we're in right now for rusty patch bumblebee, for example. So let's talk a little bit about bumblebees that are federally listed. And some of you are probably familiar with the rusty patch bumblebee. It was the first bumblebee listed under the Endangered Species Act in 2017. The Fish and Wildlife Service conducted their SSA in 2016. We proposed it for the species for listing, and then it was listed as federally endangered in 2017. And we just finalized the recovery plan this summer. So it's kind of hot off the press. And I'll be talking more about rusty patch bumblebee and some of the cool things that people are doing to recover this species and learn more about it in later slides. But first, I'll talk a little bit about a few other bumblebee species. And so the Franklin's bumblebee, this was the second bumblebee listed under the Endangered Species Act. It was listed in 2021, following a species status assessment a few years earlier. And Franklin's really has the most limited distribution of all North American bumblebees, probably, and possibly even in the world. I don't know, but it's only known from a few counties in Oregon and 2 counties in California, and it's found in higher elevations. And the Fish and Wildlife Service and its partners, right now, the main priority for this species is to determine whether or not it still exists out on the landscape. And so folks are out there conducting surveys across this historical range. Another thing that folks are doing out there is exploring the use of environmental DNA. So you might hear people say eDNA. It's essentially, they'll be looking at flower samples to see if we can detect Franklin's DNA on those flowers that would indicate then that it's still out there. So yeah, that's it for federally listed species. There's currently only 2 listed bumblebee species in the US, but there's more that we're considering for listing or that were considered in the past. So I'll get into that. And so one of the bumblebees that was ultimately not recommended for listing is the yellow-banded bumblebee. The Fish and Wildlife Service conducted a species status assessment for this species back in 2018, made the determination that the species did not warrant listing at the time. And some of the reasons behind that, I wasn't intimately involved in this, but from what I understand, the reasons are, that it was still represented quite well across its historical range. It was continuing to exist and be found in 15 ecoregions spanning most of Northern America and much of Canada. And there's consistent numbers across multiple states since the 1950s, really, although there has been some declines for this species. And now I'll talk a little bit about some species that are under consideration for listing under the Endangered Species Act. The Western bumblebee is one of those. It's currently under review. The Fish and Wildlife is conducting a status assessment for this species now with a listing decision to follow, so stay tuned for that. In the meantime, the service and our partners are really focusing on doing a lot of monitoring for this species. The McKay's bumblebee, I don't have a picture of it, but it was recently elevated to a full species. It was previously thought to be a subspecies of Western bumblebee. And so McKay's will be included in the status assessment for Western bumblebee too. So stay tuned for that. Oh, and here's a range map showing kind of the breakdown of the distribution roughly of McKay's bumblebee, shown in blue on the top, kind of in Alaska, and then the Western bumblebee is shown in red. There are a few other species were recently petitioned for listing. The American bumblebee was petitioned for listing last year in 2021. And there was a positive 90-day finding for that species. And so the species status assessment is forthcoming, likely a few years out. And this species was pretty widely distributed across about 36 states, up into Canada, and then down into Mexico. The variable cuckoo bumblebee, a parasite on the American bumblebee that I just talked about, was petitioned for listing earlier this year. And Jamie talked a little bit about cuckoo bumblebees, but they're social parasites of other bumblebees. They don't produce workers of their own. Instead, they join nests of other bumblebees, allowing for the host bumblebee to care for their workers and larvae. And so, as you can imagine, their survival is very closely linked to the survival of their hosts. The Fish and Wildlife Service will assess this species concurrently with the American bumblebee. And then the Suckley's cuckoo bumblebee is also petitioned for listing recently. There was a recent positive 90-day finding, which essentially means that there was enough information for us to carry forward our analysis and the process. And so similar to the variable cuckoo bumblebee, this one too is a social parasite. It's been found breeding in the nests of Western bumblebee, but it's also been found in other bumblebee nests as well, in other species nests. So that was kind of a quick overview of all the species that are being considered or are already listed. And so I'm going to go quickly into some of the work that's being done for rusty patch bumblebee. And I know that there's an Eastern bumblebee identification course later on in this series, but note here that on the left, those two illustrations showing kind of the queens and the workers. The males look very similar to the workers. And notice that there's a rusty patch on the workers and males that's completely surrounded by yellow. And then there's a thumbtack kind of black spot between the wings. And so those kind of are some key identifying characteristics of this species. But notice too that on the right, the drawing on the right is a queen. It looks different. It doesn't have that rusty patch. They're entirely yellow on the first two abdominal segments, and the rest of the abdominal segments are black. And they're not to scale here, but you can see the queens are generally larger in size than the workers and males. And then I just have an arrow here showing you where that little rusty patch is to look out for on rusty patch bumblebees. There's some that also have a rusty patch, but they're kind of abut the black. And so you want to be careful when you're identifying the species. Rusty patch bumblebee emerges in the spring and goes into hibernation in the fall. So to meet its nutritional needs, it requires a constant diverse supply of flowers that bloom from spring through the fall. The nectar provides carbohydrates and the pollen provides that protein. And rusty patch gather pollen and nectar from a wide variety of flowers. And also rusty patch is a short tongue species. I can't remember if Jamie talked about that, but basically that means they're not able to easily access nectar and flowers with the long, deep petals of a flower. And so you can see a little bit on this photo. I was hoping to show you a video, but I didn't get to it. But you can see on this photo that the bee is actually poking a hole into the side of this monarda here with its tongue to access the nectar that way, instead of kind of sticking its full face directly into the long corolla of a flower, like a long-tongued bumblebee would do. A rusty patch bumblebee have really been found in a total variety of habitats, including prairies, grasslands, woodlands, marshes, urban parks, and gardens. They've been found everywhere. And we have a lot to learn still about this species and its habitat preferences, but we kind of are divide our thinking of habitat needs based on the time of the year. So for example, we think about nesting and overwintering and where it might be during those times of the year. And then we also look at foraging habitat types based on the relative timing of pollen and nectar availability. And the locations of pollen and nectar sources for rusty patch vary throughout the growing season. And so you got to keep that in mind too. Also, an interesting thing that I wanted to point out too, a lot of people think of pollinators, gardens, and kind of these open grasslands, but really I want to point out the importance of forest and woodlands because we think that the species is using early emerging flowers, the spring ephemerals that are present in woodlands, And also, we think that it might be overwintering in woodland habitats. And so I want to point that out. Oh, and yeah, Fish and Wildlife and our partners have developed just kind of a wide variety of tools and guidance to help folks conserve the species. Survey protocols, conservation management guidance, all kinds of stuff. One of those things is this plant guide that you can use to help attract rusty patch to your yard if you plant some of these flowers. And it's kind of divided up by early, mid, and late flowers and kind of the amount of shade and things like that. It's a really useful tool, and that's shown here on the right. But then there's other plant lists from other regions and other areas, and examples, some of those examples are listed here. We also had, besides the Midwest guide for rusty patch, we also had some kind of plant lists for other regions where it was found historically, and we're working to get those back up on our website and available for folks. So the range of the species, it was historically found, was really wide ranging, occurring throughout much of the eastern US up into Canada. And the gray region here is showing the background is the historical county range of the rusty patch bumblebee. But it really experienced some significant and rapid declines in the 1990s and early 2000s. And this map is also showing the 10 by 10 kind of kilometer grids that we use to track the species. Where it has been found historically, those are the black ones. And then where it has been found since 2007 are shown in green. And you can see here that the hotspots are really up here in the Midwest and then down in the Appalachians. And so I'm going to zoom in to the Midwest here to get a little closer look of the range in the Midwest. And here's a map of what we knew to exist in 2016 and what we know. So here's 2016 and here's what we know now to exist out there. And so as you can see, people have found the species to be present at more locations than what we knew at the time of listing. However, it's important to point out that each one of these polygons that you see here could represent just one occurrence record. And also, I want to point out, that there's some hotspots around Minneapolis here and in Madison, for example, in these urban areas. I also want to zoom into the Appalachians in West Virginia and Virginia. The same is true where we knew the species. Here's where we knew the species to exist in 2016. And now we know the species exist in more places than we thought then. So this is the most recent records, recent areas where we know the species to still exist down here. And while it's encouraging that we have found the species in more places than we knew at the time of listing, we also know that survey effort has increased since then. And so additional observations are, a little bit to be expected there. But the areas on the map also aren't necessarily an indicator of the population health. And even with increased survey effort, there's still no recent observations throughout most of its historical range. And there's a lot of people out there looking for the species across the country. Yeah, so why the decline? The decline, Jamie talked about this a little bit, and I won't spend too much time here, but it's likely due to multiple interacting stressors. But it's really difficult to determine the specific underlying causes of the decline that happened in the past, because it's in the past and it remains elusive. But there's several general hypotheses that have been proposed to explain the decline. Kind of all these factors, pesticide, pathogens, parasites, all working together to cause declines. But harmful pathogens, like Jamie talked about, those are currently the primary suspect for the widespread and rapid decline of rusty patch bumblebee. Back to the recovery plan, the Fish and Wildlife, we just finished the recovery plan this summer, and you might, if you're familiar with recovery plans at all, they're in the past, they've been really thick documents with a lot of detail, and we've kind of flipped that a little bit. And now they're very concise documents. They only contain kind of the statutory requirements of the criteria, actions, and time and cost estimates. And what used to make up the bulk of recovery plans is now in the recovery implementation strategy, which is basically allows us a lot more flexibility to develop and prioritize things as we move along, learn from those things, and then adapt our approach and activities as we move forward with recovery. In the recovery plan, we have a vision for Rusty Patch, and the vision is to conserve a sufficient number and distribution of populations to ensure its long-term viability, and to eventually remove it from the endangered species list, right? And so to achieve that long-term viability, the species must endure pressures of environmental stressors, stochasticity, environmental and demographic stochasticity, stressors, catastrophes, and novel changes in the environment, which will require multiple healthy populations widely distributed across its range to do that. And so we have a phased approach to approach recovery. As recovery proceeds, our specific activities might differ, especially in different parts of the range. And so in the recovery plan, we delineated these 5 conservation units with the goals of capturing climatic conditions, habitat types, and life history behaviors, and also kind of organize ourselves so we can prioritize areas in different parts of it, or prioritize tasks in different portions of its range. In the recovery plan 2, we have 2 downlisting criteria. The first gives a minimum number of healthy populations within each conservation unit and a stable of increasing trend in occupancy over time. The second criteria is talking more about the spatial arrangement of those populations and how they should be kind of clustered together, but also distributed across habitat types and climates. And we recognize that, when we're at this point, when we're reaching recovery, we won't be able to monitor every single population that's out there. And so we want to be able to ensure that we're monitoring a subset of them to determine their health, and essentially that will translate that there must be other healthy populations out there. And that's what these numbers essentially represent. And so you might have noticed in that we didn't really quantify what we meant by healthy, and that was intentional. We want to develop robust targets as we move forward and as we learn. And that's what we're working on now. And so, but we do say qualitatively that a population should be able to successfully recruit males and queens over time. And in order to do that, it needs to be demographically and genetically healthy. In the final recovery plan, we have 5 broad level actions, and there's a lot more detail in the plan, but just summarize briefly here. Minimizing risk due to harmful pathogens, to pesticides, managing populations, assessing the population and habitat through monitoring, and then managing and enhancing habitat. And I should say that the kind of the where the rubber really hits the road and where the who, what, where, and when is really in the phase that we're in now in the recovery implementation strategy. And so all the actions here are not in sequential order. They're all going to be happening concurrently and already are. And also all of these actions include an outreach component. And so as you can imagine, different areas across the historical range have different priorities and focus, especially initially. So for example, out east, where we're not, we only know of a few locations where the species still exists. A lot of their focus might be on surveying and really trying to find if there's more populations out there. Whereas in conservation units 1 and 2, where we have more occurrence records, recently, we can dig a little bit deeper and focus on things like studying the pathogens and their genetics and other stressors, working in habitat enhancements, and also doing surveys too. And throughout the last few years of working on the SSA and the listing and the recovery plan for the species, we've identified a lot of questions. Just a few of them are up here. But we need to know more about the life history, biology, and ecology to inform our conservation efforts as we move forward. So we have a ton of questions, and answering these questions will help us build more robust recovery targets and activities as we move forward. And so the next few slides that I have are organized by recovery actions and how we're starting to address some of those key questions. And there's a lot of folks working to conserve rusty patch bumblebee, a lot of partners that we work with that I won't be able to name them all, but just I wanted to highlight some of the work that's happening. And so action one was to minimize harmful pathogens. And so we're working with researchers to document the pathogens that are existing in current populations to help us get a better picture of what's currently going on, what's the picture of their health at this time. And this type of information will help us develop health standards and targets as we move forward. So what defines a healthy population in terms of pathogens? And then we need to figure out steps to minimize those harmful pathogens. Action two is to minimize harmful pesticides. And we're starting to work with partners to evaluate pesticides. Some of that's using some surrogate species to help assess that, but also working opportunistically to evaluate pesticide loads carried in recently kind of discovered bees that are found dead or pollen and wax samples. But there's plenty to do here, lots to do to study the risks and also to reduce them. Action three asks, how do we manage and restore populations? And working towards that, we held an in-person workshop back in 2020, last meeting that many of us attended in person for the pandemic. And it was really great. We got to talk about, think about restoration options for the species, such as reintroductions or genetic or demographic augmentations. And through us talking through that and those potential options, we identified questions that we need to answer prior to implementing those programs. Also, during that workshop and through other conversations, folks have already started working on some of this work. So, for example, we want to know, what did populations look like historically in terms of their genetics, and what do they look like now? And so we can look at things like inbreeding. We can use genetics to estimate the number of colonies in an area, given the number of workers that you sample. And colleagues from the USGS and USDA are working on those questions right now. And also a cool thing, University of Minnesota and others are working on developing some techniques for sampling genetics using eDNA as well. We want to know where they still are, right? And so there's numerous agencies conducting population surveys across the range. And there's a large community science effort to survey bumblebees too. And I'm sure that many of you participate in those efforts, which is great, it's super. And we want to encourage that because we incorporate those verified records into our database. And a few years ago, together with our partners, we launched the Backyard Bumblebee Count in iNaturalist, which is a community science effort aimed at getting a snapshot of data at a consistent time every year. And so we continue to host that annual event, and I encourage you to participate in that. We don't have the dates exactly picked out for this year, but it'll likely be in mid-July, so look for that. And also, we're working to improve our monitoring methods, so we're working with some partners with USGS to help us with that too. A lot of people are doing habitat enhancements and restorations for pollinators, and we want to get a better understanding of foraging needs and nutritional needs to inform those habitat restorations specifically for rusty patch bumblebee. We want to get a better understanding of the effects of those habitat management actions too. And there's a few partners that are also working on studying those effects. And then one way that we're looking at floral uses is to examine pollen from museum specimens across the species range to determine what they once used and historically what they, if they used some things historically and then lost that. And so we did a study that was published last year on that. The link is below. And we're also continuing to look at modern samples collected in the last couple of years to find out what the rusty patch is using now. Another interesting study I wanted to just bring up really briefly here is that in 2020, after about 30 years of no nests being studied for this species, we were excited to learn that 3 nests were discovered in 2020. I don't know if it's because people were stuck at home and looking in their backyards more, but 2 of them were in Minnesota, 1 was in Wisconsin, and then in 2021, 2 additional nests were found in Wisconsin. And so this is a super rare opportunity. It had been 30 years, and also nests are only around for a short time in the summer and fall. And so we want to take advantage of that, and we wanted to learn as much as we could. And so in both years, we quickly assembled researchers to think about what we can learn from these rare opportunities and take advantage of that. And so we investigated some key questions that we were talking about earlier, some of those ones that we already identified on the habitat biology and behavior. So looking at food preferences, genetic makeup, mating behavior, pathogen, how can we improve nest searching, how many males and workers and queens are produced, all those kinds of questions we could start to answer by looking at some of those nests. And I'm just going to quickly jump through this. That just pretty much highlights that we have a ton of people working on this. So University of Minnesota took the lead on collecting a lot of the information, but there is numerous other partners that were willing to help and able to help in various ways, and with either collections or with the analyses. And so this slide is kind of an example of the collaborative work that's ongoing to help learn about this species and ultimately to conserve it. And so, for example, we looked at primary food sources by looking at pollen. Those are being analyzed by USGS in the Northern Prairie Lab in North Dakota, as well as University of Minnesota is looking at pollen samples as well. We want to determine what pathogens are present, so we took some fecal samples, and then we looked at genetic samples to determine the health of colonies of those nests. We did some bumblebee surveys near the nests to document the larger bumblebee community, and we did some behavioral stuff. And then after the nests were abandoned for the year, 2 of the nests were dissected in 2020, 1 in 2021, to determine what pests and parasites were present, also to count the number of queens and worker cells that were produced. And those excavations only occurred after we were sure that the nests were abandoned for the year, and only by folks who were permitted to do those activities. And then we also did send some materials to a dog training group that was using them to train bumblebee nest searching dogs. And so here's just some of the preliminary results from that work. From the 2 nests that were discovered in 2020 primarily. We published a paper on that, and we reported on the colony sizes, land cover, some behavioral stuff, parasitic wasp that was discovered. And interestingly, all of these nests found in 2020 were associated with abandoned rodent nests to some degree. Even the red-winged nest, which was inside of a crawl space of an old house where there was some evidence of rodent activity. And we were able to estimate colony sizes and do some counts and things like that. So, and then there's more data that we collected that's still being analyzed and processed, and hopefully that will be out soon. But this study and all the other examples that I provided show the importance of forming great partnerships in our work. We rely on expertise of our partners and their ability to carry out activities. And the nest study especially really showed the importance of outreach and community engagement, and also the photo survey work. In 2020, those 3 nests that were discovered, they were found by private citizens. So the first nest was discovered by someone who had seen a presentation on rusty patch bumblebee and remembered what they looked like. And remember that they were important. And so all the people that we worked with on those studies were excited to have rusty patch on their property and were open to researchers coming to study the nest. And so that was super great. And then how can you help? Outreach and community engagement for this species is key, I think, for this success. You can help rusty patch bumblebee and other bumblebees by helping us learn where they still exist. You can contribute to things like the backyard bumblebee count, Bumblebee Watch or other community science efforts. If you find a nest, we are certainly interested in that. Take good pictures. We might make sure that it's rusty patch, and notify your local state or fish and wildlife person or your university. And also community members could do things in their own backyards to make them more habitable to bumblebees and other pollinators by adding floral resources. You could provide nutritious floral resources throughout the active season, flowers from early spring, summer and fall. And even small spaces can provide foraging for the species. And so also remember the woodlands are important, and we think, overwintering queens use forests. And queens certainly use emerging, that are emerging in the springtime, use those early spring blooming flowers. And we encourage folks to leave leaf litter in areas in undisturbed soil in their yard or garden. It gives you an excuse to have a messy garden, and it might be used by bees and other pollinators. And many of you might be involved in developing pollinator conservation plans or getting habitat on the ground. And in all of that pollinator work, consider the needs of bumblebees. They can be specific to the rusty patch bumblebee if your area is near where they exist, or if not, providing for bumblebees in general will help these important pollinators and will help the rusty patch bumblebee in the future, hopefully, as they expand their populations, right? And also, because anybody can make a difference with this species, it's really important to engage others and make sure folks have the right tools and know what to do. So I think that's all I had. Oh, just a brief disclaimer. And yeah, I just want to thank everybody for your time and attention today. And hopefully there's a minute or two for questions. I think I went a little longer than I expected.
Great. Thanks so much, Tam. I know your time is limited too. A really great talk, though. And I think a wonderful call to action for folks who are part of this Bumblebee short course for community scientists, because it's really that community science part that all of us can participate in, whether it's, advocating, adding habitat, helping other people learn, taking photos on a naturalist. That's all really helpful. We had 1,400 on the call live. We'll probably get another 2,000 or 3,000 views within the next week. So it's all of you out there that can really be eyes and feet on the ground helping to make this happen. Just let me ask you just one question that I think is important, not that they're all not important, but someone asked, why would you want to protect a cuckoo bumblebee since it's a nest parasite?
I think that kind of gets at the larger question of why are any endangered species important, right? And once they're gone forever. And so once a species is endangered, it's a sign that, that there's something off in the ecosystem. It's something's out of balance. And so I think that's important to keep in mind. I feel like the species themselves have their own intrinsic value, and maybe that you might not know of the exact importance to humans, but certainly importance within their ecosystem, and a lot of that we just don't know yet. But I think for rusty patch, for example, it was in terms of human importance. It was an important pollinator of cranberries, for example. So it has some implications for agriculture and things too.